Okay, we're going to talk about Plato's Euthyphro. Now, this short dialogue takes place outside of the courthouse of Athens, and it has to do with a conversation between the philosopher Socrates, who was Plato's teacher, by the way, and a young man named Euthyphro. Now, Socrates is at the courthouse to deliver his famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, apology or defense speech, which will be discussed at length in the next chapter. Euthyphro, on the other hand, is at the courthouse to prosecute his father for murder. And when Socrates learns that Euthyphro is there to prosecute his father, he is understandably alarmed. For it's not normal for a son to go against his father in this way. So what exactly happened? What were the circumstances surrounding this alleged murder? Well, Euthyphro and his elderly father live on a farm outside of Athens in the countryside, and one of their servants got into a drunken rage, homicidal rage, and killed one of their slaves. Now, homicide was considered a religious crime. It was an offense against the gods, at least for the ancient Greeks. So the proper thing to do in such a situation would be to inquire from a priest what ought to be done. And so what happened was that Euthyphro's father tied up the perpetrator, the killer, and tossed him into a ditch, presumably so that he could not escape. In the meantime, he dispatched a messenger to Athens to inquire from a priest to find out what should be done with the killer. In the meantime, while the messenger was in Athens, the killer, the perpetrator, died in the ditch, presumably of exposure to the elements. Right. So these are the circumstances that lead Euthyphro to prosecute his father for murder, for the murder of the servant who killed the slave. Now, this seems rather extreme to most of us to see this as a murder, right? In contemporary legal parlance, what occurred would most likely be deemed a negligent homicide at worst. Certainly not murder, not capital murder. But in Euthyphro's eyes, this is a murder, and Euthyphro has to make things right with the gods. And he believes that prosecuting his father for murder is the proper course of action. So Socrates wants to know more. He wants to understand from Euthyphro. He wants Euthyphro to teach him what the nature of piety is, the nature of the pious. Now, piety, generally speaking, this is not a strict definition, but it has to do with showing the proper respect or reverence toward the gods. So piety was very important to the ancient Greeks. So a pious individual is one who respects, reveres, and honors the gods in the proper way. An impious individual is one who dishonors or disrespects the gods. Socrates, as you will find out in the next chapter in the Apology, was accused of impiety. And the form of impiety that he allegedly takes is of not believing in the existence of the Greek gods. So by disbelieving in the Greek gods, one is dishonoring or disrespecting the gods. And this is what he was accused of, and he will attempt to defend himself against that and other accusations in the Apology, which is a really fascinating work, which we will go into in the next chapter. So Socrates begins a discussion with Euthyphro, which will carry on until the end of the dialogue, in which they together seek to make sense of the pious, to arrive at a definition of piety or the pious. So Euthyphro, as you will notice, is a bit of a cocky and arrogant young man. He pretends or claims to be wise with respect to divine matters. he thinks he understands the nature of the gods. He thinks he understands what piety is. He sees himself as superior to everyone else, even to Socrates. So Socrates wants to see if Euthyphro really does know what he's talking about. He puts him to the test, and he asks him to define piety. Socrates asks Euthyphro to explain the nature of piety, because Socrates claims not to know what it is, right? In the Apology, he famously says that he's wise because he knows that he knows nothing, right? He's aware of his ignorance. He has self-knowledge or self-awareness, at least with respect to what he knows and doesn't know. With respect to his ignorance, he's aware that he doesn't know the answers to all the big questions, and he certainly does not claim to know what piety is. So here, Euthyphro has the opportunity to teach Socrates something that he doesn't know. So Socrates asks for a definition, and Euthyphro's first response, the first of three definitions that will be discussed in this dialogue, is that piety is what I am doing now, prosecuting my father for murder. Now, Euthyphro is very proud of his answer. He thinks that he has solved the riddle of piety once and for all, and he's just waiting for Socrates to pat him on the back and tell him how brilliant he is. But that's not what ends up happening. All right. Now let's, for a second, try to make sense of Euthyphro's first definition. Now, he is referring to, or he's basing his at first attempt at a definition on the writings of the Greek poets. So the Greek religion, which is polytheistic, right? Zeus is at the top, and then you have all the other gods and goddesses. The Greeks, the ancient Greeks, came to know their gods or received their religion from the writings of the poets, notably the Greek poet Hesiod and Homer. Now, Homer wrote famously the Iliad and the Odyssey. Many of you have probably already read these books. So it is from the poets that the Greeks come to know their gods. And Euthyphro is using the authority of the poets to base his first definition on, right? So because Zeus went against his father after his father committed an injustice, and just as Zeus's father went against Zeus's grandfather because of an injustice committed, that Euthyphro sees Zeus as a role model. Euthyphro wants to do or live like Zeus lives. He wants to act in accordance with the principle of justice that Zeus embodies when he goes against his own father. Right? Zeus is considered to be the best and the most just of the gods, right? According to the Greek religious tradition. And Euthyphro believes that tradition is correct, and therefore he wants to use Zeus as a role model. Right, and therefore Euthyphro will go against his own father when his own father commits an injustice, and in this case, letting the slave or the servant die in the ditch constitutes a murder, and therefore Euthyphro is in his right mind, is correct, is perfectly reasonable to go against his father and prosecute him for murder. Now, Socrates makes an immediate objection to this first definition. And he says that Euthyphro has at best given only an example of the pious, but not a definition. Right? So we can't know if this or that action is pious. We cannot know whether Euthyphro's prosecution of his father is pious before we have established the nature of piety itself. Right, so Euthyphro is putting the cart before the horse. Right, we need to establish a definition of piety, and only after that can we ascertain that this or that action is pious or not. So we go to a second attempt at a definition. Euthyphro says, okay, well, let's try this. What is dear to the gods is pious. What is not is impious. Or another way of putting it, what is pleasing to the gods is pious. What is displeasing to the gods is impious. Okay, Now, Socrates, who's a brilliant mind, and he is always ahead of the game here. He knows exactly where the discussion is going, and he can quickly spot logical fallacies, and he does so here. He notices that this argument, this second attempt at a definition, leads us to a contradiction. Now, as I mentioned, the Greek gods are the Greek religion is polytheistic, so it's not just one god, but it's multiple gods. And if you've ever had the chance to read Homer's Iliad, for example, you'll see that the Greek gods, are always fighting amongst themselves. Right? They're fighting. They're rarely in agreement. They're plotting against one another. They're consumed by their passions and their lusts, and Zeus and his wife Hera are constantly fighting. Husband and wife are constantly fighting. They don't agree on much. So that being the case, and by the way, Euthyphro takes these gods seriously. He believes that they are real and that they exist, right? So the contradiction that this leads to is that one action might be viewed as pleasing by Apollo, but displeasing by Aphrodite. Or one action might be considered just by Zeus, but unjust by Hera. Right? One action might be good in the eyes of Hephaestus, but bad in the eyes of Ares. So what we have then is that we have a situation in which the same action or act can be both just and unjust, or pious and impious at the same time. And that is absurd. It's completely contradictory. Now, Socrates tries to help Euthyphro make little adjustments to the second definition. And he makes a small change to the definition and has it read, what all the gods hate is impious. What they all love is pious. Now, what difference does that make? Well, it's a decisive, important difference, because it gets rid of the problem of the contradiction, right? Let's not focus on the things that the gods disagree on. Let's just look at the types of objects or actions that all the gods are pleased by, and then that will be the pious. Let's consider that possibility. And Euthyphro enthusiastically approves of this attempt, right? This final attempt at a definition. So this brings us to a very fundamental question in the dialogue. Socrates asks, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? Now, that may appear to be two identical statements when you look at it the first time. They look similar. But one thing about philosophy that's important to recognize is that seemingly apparently small differences in statements are deceptive, because oftentimes you have just one little change of a comma or one little adjustment to a phrase can lead to a very different meaning from the opposing statement. And this is just such a case. These two statements are radically different from one another. Is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? Euthyphro is completely confused. And here, as in many other instances in the dialogue, we see that Euthyphro has never really given much serious thought to the question of what is pious. As wise as he thinks he is, as superior as he believes himself to be to everyone else, he has never really taken the time or put forth the effort to get down to the nuts and bolts of piety. Now, Socrates is looking for the form of the pious. And he asks this question early on in the dialogue. I'm looking for that form or standard of the piety, so that looking at it, I can use it as a model and compare it to all the different instances of piety, or to understand an action to be pious as opposed to impious by comparing it to the universal standard or form of the pious. In the commentary on this chapter, I use the example of chairs to explain what a form is. So for Socrates, the form is the universal essence or standard or definition of a thing, right? In this case, piety. But if we want to look at the example of chairs, which is, I think, a simpler way of looking at it, imagine you walk into a furniture store and you see all different kinds of chairs in the showroom, right? Lazy boys, dining room chairs, sofas, bean bags, what have you. Now, they all are different. No two chairs are alike or identical in the showroom. They all have different shapes, different forms, different colors. They're made from different materials. No two chairs are identical. And yet, you immediately recognize all of these various objects to correspond to the type or the nature of what we would call chairness. They all immediately disclose themselves to be members of this universal class, chair or chairness, right? So this is what Socrates is getting at. He wants us to arrive at an understanding of the essence, the nature of the pious, so that once we grasp it, we can look at different actions, such as Euthyphro's prosecution of his father for murder, and determine immediately whether these actions are pious or not. That is to say, whether these actions correspond to the definition or the essence of piety that our minds have grasped, or whether they fail to correspond to it. And Euthyphro is unable to give Socrates this kind of a definition, this universal standard. Okay, so this is very important. Now, coming back to the central question, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? Here is the decisive difference between the two statements. In the first statement, right, piety is distinct or separate from the gods, from whatever the gods love or hate, whatever they desire. The pious is an independent entity. It is a standard that is set apart from the gods. Okay, the gods can discover it, they can know it, but they don't create it. It doesn't depend on the gods, right? It is separate. In the second instance, piety depends entirely on the gods. In this case, it depends on what is loved by the gods. It depends on the act of being loved by the gods. In other words, whatever the gods happen to love will be pious. So imagine a god who loves suicide bombers, to give a somewhat relevant and contemporary example, right? Or a god that loves the killing of innocent people, we'll put it that in less political terms. If that's what that god loves, then killing innocent people would be an act of piety, would be an act of honor and reverence towards the divine. Now, do you see the problems there, right? When you make the pious dependent upon the potentially arbitrary whims of the gods, you run into all sorts of problems, right? Your piety is only as good as the gods of your religious tradition. Whereas Socrates wants to get gods out of the picture and understand piety in and of itself, the form of piety, right? Completely separated off from whatever the gods happen to love or hate. He wants to isolate this quality and understand it by itself, okay? Okay, so the problem then with saying that piety is what is dear to the gods is that it doesn't really tell us the nature or essence of piety. It doesn't answer the question, what is the pious? At best, it gives you a quality of the pious. Right? Let me give you an example. Imagine you are a time traveler you were born in the Middle Ages and you got into a time machine and you traveled into the future and you ended up in my office in the 21st century, and we started talking, and I told you you saw a can of Coca-Cola on my desk, and you had no idea what it was, absolutely no idea what it was, and you asked me, "What is that? What is Coca-Cola?" And if I were to answer to you, if I were to say, Coca-Cola is something that I really enjoy, right? It's something that I really love. Would that answer your question? Would that tell you the nature or the essence of what Coke is, right? Of course not. It would just give you a quality of it, namely the quality of being loved by me. But it doesn't tell you what it is. You don't know that it's a beverage. You don't know that it's sweet, that it's carbonated, right? You have no idea what it is, except the only thing do know is that I happen to like it. But that doesn't tell you anything. And that's essentially what Euthyphro is doing by answering the question about piety, saying that it is what is loved by the gods. He's not really getting to the heart of the question. Okay, so Euthyphro makes a final attempt to salvage this third attempted definition by saying the pious is the part of justice that is concerned with the care of the gods. Right, so he wants to divide justice into two types of things. There's the part of the just that deals with human beings and their dealings with one another, and then there's the remaining part of justice that is concerned with the way human beings care for the gods. And that second part is what pious is. That's what Euthyphro wants to argue. But then Socrates gets Euthyphro to realize that it really makes no sense to say that human beings care for the gods. You can't care for a god the way you care for your child, right? Your child is needy, is incomplete, is not self-sufficient, needs protection, and so forth, right? A god is not needy. A god cannot be cared for the way a child can be cared for. Gods are self-sufficient. They're indestructible. They're eternal. They're beyond natural necessity. They don't need to eat or sleep. They don't need medical care. They're perfect. So to say that you care for the gods, that a mortal creature cares for an immortal creature, or an imperfect creature cares for a perfect being, doesn't make a lot of sense. And in the end, Euthyphro admits that what he means by care of the gods is giving honors and sacrifices to the gods. That's what piety ends up being for Euthyphro, honoring and revering and pleasing the gods, right? And that brings us full circle to the second definition, which is the pious is what is dear to the gods. And we saw that that was flawed because it doesn't give you a definition. It simply gives you a quality of the pious, namely that it is dear to the gods. So we have failed to arrive at a satisfactory definition of the pious. Now, Socrates, at the very end of the dialogue, he tells Euthyphro, look, this is a very important matter. You're prosecuting your father for murder on the basis of a notion of piety that is incomplete. We need to get to the bottom of this. We need to answer the question immediately. This is urgent. And what does Euthyphro do? He looks at his watch and says, I got to go. I'm done with this. And he takes off. And that's the end of the conversation, the discussion. So they failed in their attempt to arrive at a satisfactory definition of piety. But was the conversation itself a complete failure? Well, one can say at the very least that progress was made toward the discovery of a correct definition of piety. How? Well, by, at the very least, removing three defective definitions of piety from the pool of potentially correct definitions. So they got closer, if only by inches, to the form of the pious. And in that sense, it was a worthwhile enterprise. All right, well, thank you for listening, and I hope you found this helpful.